Welcome to this video production of the Unified Theory of Knowledge and the Construction of the Fifth Joint Point, a new form of knowledge technology for moving toward wisdom in the 21st century. The Unified Theory consists of 8 key ideas. The first and most central is the tree of knowledge system. The other 8 ideas consist of justification systems theory, behavioral investment theory, the influence matrix, character adaptation systems theory, the wheel of development, the nested model of well-being, and COM-MO, which is an integrative approach to psychological mindfulness. These 8 ideas make up the unified theory of knowledge, which can be thought of as either a scientific humanistic philosophy or a meta-psychology that bridges science, psychology, and philosophical ethics together in a holistic picture. The unified theory has been organized into a garden representation, with the theory of knowledge tree carrying a representation of each of the 8 key ideas. The first branch on the theory of knowledge tree is, somewhat confusingly, the tree of knowledge system. There are 7 other branches, such as the justification systems theory, behavioral investment theory, the influence matrix, character adaptation systems theory, the character wheel of development, the nested model of well-being, and COM-MO. It's worth noting here that the tree, the theory of knowledge tree, sits in a metaphorical garden called the Garden of Eutopia. This is a meta-modern, sincere, ironic representation of a wisdom philosophy for the 21st century. In it represents a wide variety of different ideas that I believe lay the groundwork for what is needed for us to move towards a healthier, more sustainable, more fulfilling society. It consists of the stepping stone, the Eutopia seeds, and 2 kinds of bees. All of these provide particular kinds of symbolic representations and hidden meaning that weave together a tapestry of thought that sets the stage for a scientific humanistic philosophy. What I'm going to be talking about today mostly is the tree of knowledge system and how it sets the stage for a new set of technologies, knowledge technologies, that I believe can create what Jordan Hall calls a transcendental operator that allows us to correspond, connect, and serve as a kind of Rosetta Stone that pulls together in an integrated pluralistic fashion different visions for wisdom, functioning, technologies, and other kinds of modes of being that enable us to transform from the current society, which I believe is unsustainable, unworkable, and struggling at multiple levels, to one that is fundamentally more fulfilling and perhaps can be considered a society we both would be proud of and proud to have our children grow up in. To do that, I'd like to talk for a second about the knowledge pyramid, just to position where my analysis with the unified theory comes. The knowledge pyramid is well known and consists of a pyramid as follows that starts with data, and data then is moved into system information processing, which take the forms of the data and translate them into a particular language, which then is organized into knowledge schema, and ultimately values-based knowledge applied toward the good sets the stage for wisdom. Now, in terms of the focus of the unified theory, specifically the tree of knowledge system, it is a form of knowledge technology that allows us to organize much of science, specifically the modern, empirical, natural science system that maps the beginning of the universe up to the present, from quantum mechanics all the way up through societies. An interesting feature that I will emphasize about the tree of knowledge is that it orients us towards what we can call the 5th joint point. The 5th joint point is a pathway to emergence of a new dimension of existence, and, according to the tree of knowledge, this emergence is what is happening at this juncture. And the tree of knowledge provides a frame for understanding this fifth joint point so that we can design a future that is congruent with our values. It is the framing that allows us to constrain and organize the core, ultimate meta processes that coordinate value and orient us towards the interface of technology, relation, and Mother Earth, the ecology we find ourselves in, so that we can enable the capacity of building the good society, one that cultivates as much wisdom as possible. To do so, it's helpful to situate ourselves in the current context, which I often refer to as the age of confusion, and collapse into what I call the digital identity problem. A central thesis of the digital identity problem, the age of confusion, is that in the modern 20th century, a conception of modern science emerged that was experienced to be at odds with foundational religious concerns of spirit and morality. Associated with this conflict also emerged a postmodern breakdown, with the ultimate consequence being we no longer have a shared sense of what is true and good, and how to ground ourselves in a comprehensive meaning system. This is the modern meaning crisis. This is very similar and aligns directly with what John Vervaeke identifies in his brilliant series, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. The digital identity problem, to my mind, consists of four great meta-crises in the 21st century. They are the techno-environmental crisis. This involves climate change, resource depletion, mass extinction, and weapons of mass destruction, among other things, to create the Anthropocene. This is the man-dominated epoch where humans are changing virtually everything in the planet and doing so in a way that threatens its stability very much over the long term and maybe over the more immediate long term, as well as creating elements that include existential risk, such as weapons of mass destruction. The second element is what's called the digital globalization crisis, which can be summarized as follows. The digital world is changing everything. This will become clearer in terms of exactly why from a unified theory of knowledge perspective, but of course, I'm sure everyone has an experience of being transformed or have a sense of transformation, certainly anyone that's over 30 years old, transformation of the emerging internet, the emerging iPhones, the Internet of Things, big data, social media, et cetera, et cetera. There is an enormous, we are awash in a digital world that has risen up upon us in the not only the recent future, but it is going to create a change in virtually every aspect of our existence. And the question is, how can we manage this emerging change relative to the existing structures and all of their both potentials and constraints and limitations? And how do we do it to connect back to the central thesis in a way that fosters our ability both for concrete sense making and the identification of the logos, and for other meaning structures, for example, arranging our connection with the pathos, that is our immediate emotional embodied experience of being and the elements of living involving sex, aggression, core emotional strivings, and mythos, our shared mythic narratives of our place in the cosmos that inspires art, that inspires potential, that organizes our ethos. And all of this doing so in the sense that allows our mental well-being, our mental health to flourish and to foster growth and optimal development. I saw a statistic the other day from the CDC that did a survey in June, late June, of 2020, of course, in the following the COVID crisis, whereby the results found that 1 in 4 young adults from the age 18 to 25 had seriously considered suicide in the past month. That in and of itself is a striking figure that shows how much depression, anxiety, related issues we are facing. The point here is that the digital identity problem has enormous potential consequences, from damaging the earth to mental health suffering to war and devastation. And we are on a path, I believe, that if we do not change fundamentally in the kind of growth, economic growth metrics, core values, conceptual understanding, this is a very, very likely possibility. We need, as Thomas Bjorkman said, to consider fundamentally what kind of world we create and recognize what it is in our power, and whether or not we will continue, like a Titanic headed toward the iceberg, to continue to fuel the fires of the digital identity problem, or if we can shift and start to build certain kinds of elements that will foster what I would then label the digital identity solution. This is the kind of knowledge technology that the unified theory of knowledge affords. And the tree of knowledge is a crucial element in framing what will become, at least I propose, as the digital identity solution. So let me briefly review the tree of knowledge system, which is the first branch or first key idea that makes up the unified theory of knowledge. It is a cosmic evolutionary theory about both reality and our scientific knowledge about that reality. This is an absolutely key point that makes the tree of knowledge such a different picture, big picture view, contrasted to, say, big history or other views that track the evolution of complexity from Big Bang to present. It is a map of 4 dimensions linked by 4 theoretical joint points. It is a way to organize the major domains of science, and crucially for our present purposes, the tree of knowledge gives rise to the notion of the 5th joint point. The 5th joint point is offered as a knowledge frame to understand where we are and why we might be having the difficulties that we are having, and how we might be able to reframe the current situation to create the proper constraints that guides the evolution of complexity, most notably mediated by the digital in the 21st century, that enables us to achieve the kind of flourishing and fulfillment that makes us both proud and we feel good for our children and the ancestors that we will be serving as in the 21st century and beyond. So the tree of knowledge is this depiction, this map of cosmic evolution that maps the energy information flow across time and levels and dimensions of complexity. It starts, as so many do, in our basic modern cosmological formulation with energy as an ultimate common denominator. We can call the singularity at the beginning a pure energy singularity. I know there's debate in physics about whether or not we should think about energy as a pure entity or really whether it's a quantity representing some material substance or things along those lines. But for now, a pure energy singularity that then results in some sort of quantum fluctuation and a massive expansion that ultimately now allows us much confidence that we see the expansion of the universe and the cosmic microwave background radiation that escapes when energy matter decoupling occurs, so that we can actually look back and see the beginnings of our universe in this pattern of temperature, photonic temperature. And the Big Bang sets the stage in the language of the unified theory to give rise to matter. Matter is the first dimension of behavioral complexity that comes out of Big Bang, and it consists of the dimensions of space and time, the base of which is what might be called the implicate order from David Bohm's physics, but at the very least we can consider it the quantum mechanical fields that sit at the fundamental units and structure at the very small, and then the shape of the universe across the very large, whereby general relativity maps the way in which mass curves space-time and gives rise to various galaxy clusters, and across complexity, where we're referring to the nested part-whole relations that go from the simplest elements, like simplest particles, like an electron, into a hydrogen atom, then nested into increasingly complex chemical molecular wholes. Then on planet Earth, approximately 4 billion years ago, we see the emergence of life. At least the outline of a framework is in place that allows us to see how lipids may have formed an outer membrane, and then RNA serves as the storage of particular kinds of essentially digits of information, and then that somehow that combination jumpstarts a replication process that then allows natural selection to operate on individuals across time to give rise to a population genetic pool that shapes the populations and accounts for, at least in outline, the tree of life, such that natural selection operating on genetic combination ultimately sets the stage for the modern evolutionary synthesis. Unique to the tree of knowledge is that a very similar kind of process emerges with what is called the dimension of mind, which corresponds to the animal plane of existence, which refers to the way in which animals behave as whole units mediated by the brain and nervous system and communicate with each other to create a fundamentally different way of being in the world. According to the unified theory, this is the dimension upon which perspectival phenomenology, that first-person experience of being, would emerge. And we see an emergence of complex animals ranging from insects into birds and ultimately primates. Just like life, according to the unified theory, mind is a function of behavioral selection. That's the behavior of the animal as a whole and the various associations and contingencies that emerge that then shape what is selected and what is retained. Connected to a neurocognitive functional informational view of information being stored, instantiated, and processed by the neural networks inside the nervous system. And then finally, the fourth plane of existence on the tree of knowledge is culture. This emerges in the hominid line and emerges as a function initially of language, reaching a tipping point of justification that gives rise to a whole new adaptive problem, the problem of justification and sorting out personal, social, and analytic elements of propositional statements and engaging in dialogical question and answer processes that shape the ways in which tribes act, how they relate, the narratives they construct, which legitimize is an ought. This, too, is argued to be a feedback loop between systems of justification that have particular kinds of features that channel information and resources a particular way, and symbols and justification units that serve as the informational codes for these large-scale interconnected systems of justification that evolve as humans talk, narrate, develop code, religions, etc. The tree of knowledge, as suggested, maps the world via the four dimensions linked by four joint points, and thus strongly embraces the internalization of a four-dimensional worldview. So we have dimensions of complexity, and which can then organize our classes of objects into inanimate, animate, animal, and human. We can have process dimensions, physiochemical process, biogenetic, neuropsychological, sociolinguistic. Classes of science, the physical, biological, psychological, and social sciences. We can consider entities that operate on various dimensions or planes of existence. And there are different kinds of classes of information that are operative networked together across these different dimensions. It suggests then, when we are talking about human persons and human behavior, we can unweave the rainbow into the physical matter, biological life, psychological mind, and social culture dimensions, such as the tree of knowledge serving as a lens through which the white light of human behavior can then be fractured through so that we can then see individuals as consisting of clusters of different behavioral frequencies that take place on the matter, life, mind, and culture dimensions mediated by different information processing systems and communication with other entities at that dimension. The reason there are four different dimensions of behavioral complexity is that following matter, the new dimensions emerge because of novel information processing and communication systems, most clearly life, which involves cell-cell communication, and genetic information processing inside of a cell. mind, which involves animal-animal communication and neuronal information processing inside the nervous system, and finally culture, which involves person-to-person communication and symbolic information processing. The tree of knowledge argues that we should then consider 4 different joint points that identify the major transitions that give rise to the emergence of a new plane of existence mediated by the novel information processing communication system. That's especially true following matter. But the basic first joint point is the theoretical merger of quantum mechanics and general relativity into a coherent and unified theory of quantum gravity, which people like Stephen Hawking spent much of his life contemplating and exploring. There's the natural selection operating on genetic combinations that gives rise to the structure of cells and organisms. And then these 2 new ideas that are part of the unified theory of knowledge, behavioral investment theory, which collapses a wide variety of different paradigms in the animal, behavior, mind, brain sciences to provide a neurocognitive functionalist view of mental behavior as coordinating cost-benefit analysis and making predictions in relationship to work effort investment to control the flow of resources in a particular way. And then finally, justification systems theory, which explains how human primates evolved into persons that operate on the culture dimension of existence. The tree of knowledge is a theory about how our scientific knowledge is organized. Specifically, it divides the world into the ontic reality, that is the reality independent of human belief, and the scientific ontological theories about that reality that are then shaped in terms of science by the scientific epistemological processes and methods of justifying those ontological claims about the ontic reality. It depicts, unlike many systems, because of justification systems theory, the unified theory of knowledge identifies science as a particular kind of justification, and that is crucial because it allows us to place exactly what scientific knowledge is in relationship to more general human folk psychological knowledge and social pragmatic considerations that are present in the general social construction of human knowledge. And we can have seen the alignment between the matter dimension in physical sciences, life in the biological sciences, mind and the psychological sciences, most notably basic psychology here, and then culture and the social sciences with human psychology being a subset of psychology that actually is part of the base, forms the base of the social sciences because it deals with human persons. We can extend the tree of knowledge with its 4 dimensions of complexity and consider that inside each dimension there are foundational units of analysis. And those foundational units of analysis can be identified in relationship to the parts that make up the fundamental units and the way the fundamental units group into wholes. So you can have part-whole group relations across different levels of analysis. That sets the stage for a combination of a levels versus dimensions of analysis that gives rise to what is called the periodic table of behavior. The periodic table of behavior identifies across the columns the dimensions of behavioral complexity. Inside those, we can think of the general object field relations. So that allow us to understand, say, the physical sciences as be concerning with object field change in general across scale, the biological sciences from cells to ecology across scale, the basic psychological sciences from the most simple animals and their various environments, and then the social sciences from individual persons up to societies. That's across scale within a dimension, and then finally there's the primary levels of analysis, part, whole, group. So if we imagine energy as the beginning that then organizes the emergence of particles, we then see the emergence of particles into atoms, into molecules. Then we jump for 10 billion years up to about 4 billion years ago. We see the emergence of organized genes and lipid systems that begin the processes of information store and replication in cells, which then give rise to the full-fledged unit of life. And of course, they organize into multicellular colony structures. Then at about the Cambrian explosion, we see the clustering of neural networks into what in the unified theory language is mind one. That's basically the mental behavior of an animal as a whole, mediated by the brain, into families and groups studied by things like behavioral ecology and in particular sociobiology. And then finally, we see the emergence of symbolic justification, mind three in the language of the unified theory, which is self-conscious justification, into the formations of families, tribes, communities, groups, ultimately then civilizations. This creates an opportunity for us to think then about these four different domains of science, but then three floors with each that ultimately gives rise to the 12 floors of science view across each. So the neuroscience is the seventh floor, behavior of the animal whole, animal behavior is the eighth floor, sociobiology is the ninth, human cognitive science and linguistics, human psychology at the individual level, and then all the social sciences represent the 12th floor of science. This sets the stage for us to then wonder, well, what possibly comes after this? We can return then to the tree of knowledge and ask this question. This orients us then to the fifth joint point. And what we've done here then is we've created through the macro level view, the theory of scientific knowledge really, that the tree of knowledge offers. We now have constructed a knowledge technology that allows us to organize natural science in a coherent whole and at the same time use it to situate ourselves in the map of our place in the cosmos. In other words, we are actually now able to ground our position in the cosmic coordinates. This is the fifth joint point. And as we look at the fifth joint point from this different angle, we see that science has created a foundation for something, and we will see that it's really then STEM, or science, technology, engineering, and math, and that fusion that then created the various technologies that are actually then going to merge with culture and society in a radically new way and bring in the digital. Indeed, that is happening as we speak. It is this process that is going to so dramatically disrupt, transform, mutate, rearrange human life. Other individuals have seen this. For example, the education philosopher Zach Stein talks powerfully about how we are between worlds and looking at transitions at the moment that are similar to what happened in the emergence of modern civilization in the axial age, or maybe even with the emergence of language and what it is that launched us from being primates into becoming persons. We are between worlds, according to Dr. Stein, and he brilliantly articulates why we need to fundamentally think about our education in across its broadest domains, and why we need a new philosophy of education so that we can understand where we are and create intergenerational transmission bridges that hold the wisdom of the past across a wide variety of different domains and set the stage to translate that into the development of our children, and so that they are in a place to construct what is going to be an unforeseeable future given the magnitude of the changes that are upon us. The historian Yuval Harari talks similarly about the interface that is coming between technology, the evolution of technology and culture, and our human identity, and talked about Homo Deus. And in this, he talks about Homo Deus will look at us much as we say may look at the higher animals like pigs. And so this, again, captures the kind of transformational element. The tree of knowledge explains why, as we will see more clearly, why this, with this notion of the fifth joint point, why this is such a nexus point of transition, and why the consequences will be so dramatic. And it does so ultimately, given our current focus, in a way that will allow us to understand the kinds of forces and elements that we're up against, the concerns and limitations of the current society, and the goals, values, and variables that are associated with what is required for us to build the kind of society, the kind of wise and value-based society that we need for our future. Ultimately, this is what's represented in the garden. The Garden of Eutopia is an artistic representation then that will capture this scientific humanistic philosophy. So let's link the garden, which is our destination, to the fifth joint point, which is our current location. So let's discuss the fifth joint point. And we will use the tree of knowledge then through it to develop a wise vision for the future. So the fifth joint point. Well, the first joint point is quantum gravity. The second joint point is the evolutionary synthesis. The third joint point is behavioral investment theory. The fourth joint point is justification systems theory. And so here we find ourselves at the dimension, at the fifth joint point. What is it? Well, for now, my placeholder is meta-culture. Meta meaning above, beyond, transcending, but also including. So the meta-culture is when you look out at the landscape of what kind of lifestyles, entities that make up Homo Deus, they will be occupying the metacultural landscape, or the fifth dimension of existence or way of being in the world. So the fifth joint point is then the pathway through, actually what I will call the singularity. I will come back to that very briefly, into what then is emerging as a digital metacultural dimension of existence. What are some of the elements of that fifth plane? Well, the first and foremost is the emergence of the digital medium. Notice what the tree of knowledge teaches us about what gives rise to these dramatic and qualitative shifts in emergence. Notice there are a wide variety of different kinds of emergence, but I do like to divide them up into minor and major forms. The minor forms of emergence are things like, for example, when an atom, two atoms get together, say two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom to form water, and the properties of water emerge as novel because of the novel arrangement of the constituents. That is a weak form of emergence. However, when information got stored in the nervous system to coordinate the behavior of the animal as a whole with an active body, we saw the explosion from the dimension of life into the dimension of mind. That was a strong emergence. Indeed, life, mind, and culture are all examples of strong emergence, because in each case we can see clearly what happened was a complex adaptive plane of existence tied together by novel information processing and communication interface systems. Well, that's exactly what we saw happen in the 20th century. As we look back at the 20th century, we see the emergence of computers, okay, which are basically material technological systems that are now can be networked and communicate with each other, store information, process it. We saw the emergence of the internet, and then we saw the emergence of all sorts of interface, perhaps most famously, the iPhone interface. But what we are seeing then is enormous amounts of information interface with the digital, and that will only continue in more and more deep and profound ways. The metacultural dimension represents the ways in which we will maintain our connection through grounded in culture, down into our identities at the level of nations, at the level of religions, at the level of belief value networks, into our communities, into ourselves, and then into our mental phenomenological world, into our living physiological world, and ultimately the physiochemical world in which we're embedded. So the metacultural question is, how do we achieve effective ensoulment and embrace the wise ways of living that enable us to be fulfilled as we transition into the digital medium. And I believe that in order to maintain or realize that fulfillment, we need to realize the transcendent. By realizing the transcendent, I mean we need to wake up to the idea of the ultimate concern that Paul Tillich described, the ultimate end point that Aristotle decided. I characterize this in my work. The placeholder for this point is called the elephant sun god, where the elephant is a metaphor from John Godfrey Sachs, and that connects to that there are many different angles and many different parts. It also corresponds to the Hindu elephant sun god, where my tradition attempts to reach to other religious traditions and just connect with the iconic ultimate representations of the good, and how we can see that in an integrative, pluralistic way. So for me, and this, by the way, corresponds to what Zach Stein has talked about, for example, in his Emerge podcast with Daniel Thorson, about elements in relationship to, well, how do we develop the skills and algorithms necessary to regulate the digital medium? How are we ensouled in relationship to our shadows, our core socio-emotional processes, our embodied relationships? And what is the transcendent that will allow us to connect our core sense of oneness to the world and orient ourselves towards ultimate concerns? It's fulfillment across skill development, ensoulment, and transcendence that Zach Stein argues to be necessary for us to live fully as human beings. And I see core parallels with the emergence of how we can organize a wise consideration of the emergence of the fifth dimension of existence and our pathway to that in constructing the fifth joint point. So a vision of wisdom, which would include then elements of the digital identity solution, are we need to search for and develop transcendent or metacultural values. In relationship to the garden, you will see, in my own view, this dignity, well-being, and integrity, and thus being a way that enhances dignity and well-being with integrity, are my big three values that I believe transcend cultural context and allow me to orient towards global ways of being in the world. Indeed, dignity connects to the United Declaration of Human Rights and grounds elements of justice and ultimate value and grounds for aesthetics and the valuing process itself. Well-being connects to things like the mission of the World Health Organization and health, happiness, and optimal functioning across the biological, psychological, and social dimensions of analysis. Integrity refers to soundness, honesty, truth, and a commitment to those features and is exemplified by the institution and ideals of science. So, the United Declaration of Human Rights and its coordination with dignity, the World Health Organization, and well-being in science. Notice all of these can be thought of as metacultural institutions in the sense that they transcend politics, they transcend national identity, religious considerations, and thus this value structure is fundamentally about a metacultural value structure. And this is just one example of how one might seek and develop transcendent values that organize and serve as lodestars for developing frames about the ultimate concern. We need more than the transcendent to organize our mythos, but we also need much better frames for sense and meaning making regarding our logos. And the unified theory affords this via the tree of knowledge system and the way it maps huge branches of science and corresponds them to the core ontic realities of matter, life, mind, and culture in a novel way. This consolidation of science into a meta-scientific worldview framework is exactly the kind of consolidation that is necessary to counteract the fragmented pluralistic set of knowledge that's sort of the free-floating empiricism that science became in the 21st century has resulted in too much siloing and fragmentation and not enough comprehension, sense, and meaning making. We also need to fundamentally understand human nature and its relationship to nature. There are many, many movements realizing that our alienation from nature, both in terms of what kind of life we lead and the ecological damage that we are doing needs to be reversed. And the metaphor of the garden serves many, many different references and associations, and certainly the connection to understanding human nature and its connection to ecology is crucial. And of course, as a metapsychology, the unified theory of knowledge says an enormous amount about what our core natures are. Perhaps most notably in relationship to this is that what humans fundamentally seek in terms of at the level of the psychosocial goals, once their biophysiological and safety goals are met, is the experience of relational value. That ultimately should be the fundamental socioeconomic marker That is, what is the experience of being known and valued that each individual has, that groups have? How do we enhance the experience of mutual relational value at the psychosocial, emotional layer of relation, of existence, of community? It is that should be what we work towards, and creating the commons of relation where we maximize the likelihood that an individual will be plugging into a relational world that affords them the experience of being known and valued and able to contribute to a group in a productive and meaningful way. And then finally, we must, of course, realize what the digital means in terms of giving rise to new information processing communication systems and the endless varieties of interface and opportunity, but also deep dangers and fears. If the digital becomes disconnected from the metacultural and the transcendent, we will create algorithms and machines that end up controlling us and alienating us profoundly and create our own hell on earth, much as was illustrated in the movie The Matrix. So, what do we need to do? We need to move towards a synthetic, meaning holistic, humanistic, scientific philosophy, and I offer this with the unified theory of knowledge as a meta-psychology framework that bridges a unified view of psychology to philosophy and orients us towards the needed frames that fills in the gaps of the Enlightenment and corresponds us to where we are in the cosmos and what we need to do. I have done this, one version of this, with a new form of a knowledge technology that include the iQuad coin and the garden. And I'll offer some basic frames of reference for these elements so that we can share what I mean by the knowledge technologies and artistic forms that have been developed. The iQuad coin is an actual coin and, of course, can then be represented here that on the one hand has the iQuad symbol, which I will discuss, and on the other, an engraving of the theory of knowledge tree. And, of course, the theory of knowledge tree sits in the garden of Atua with the elephant sun god rising over the backdrop. So, to understand what some of these symbols are, and again, all I can do in this time frame is give the interlocking network of meaning and help just sort of offer a promissory note that inside this meaning is essentially a labyrinth that then, if you were to follow it, would allow you essentially a new way to educate yourself, and I mean that in the way in which Zach Stein means it, a way to understand oneself, a way to understand human knowledge, a way to understand our past, our current situation, and orient us towards the wise decisions that we need to be making for the future. So, we've already discussed the fifth joint point and how that sets the stage for us to view where we are and recognize that the 21st century is very much about the emergence of the digital metacultural dimension of existence. And the construction of the fifth joint point is essentially what are the constraints and networks and emerging elements that give rise to this dimension, and how do we do it with wisdom? I hope that viewers of this channel will know Wilber's epistemological quadrants and will have some idea about how they align with the unified theory. I spoke on this briefly in my description of the unified framework in an earlier integral series video. I will introduce the idea of what's called the iQuad coin and the newly introduced conception of what's called quadratics, whereby that draws a very clear linkage between Wilber's epistemological quadrants and the fundamental ontological categories, matter, life, mind, and culture, that are present in the unified theory of knowledge. And finally, if you return to the 12 floors of behavior, this is going to set the stage for a linkage between the fifth joint point and the 13th floor, and ultimately that is going to provide a metaphor of where we are and what we need to do to start the process of constructing the digital metacultural dimension, or at least understanding the process by which we are engaged in networking together the fifth joint point to enable that emergence. So the iQuad coin refers to a new way to conceptualize the human persons and their place in the cosmos, There are other slide decks on the iQuad coin on the Unified Theory of Knowledge homepage. So I'm just going to briefly narrate a few elements of this. So to understand what iQuad is, that is, it stands for 1, and it's achieved 1 by the square root of -1 raised to the 4th dimension. So that's an important piece to understand that I will not get into, but ultimately the I is the imaginary dimension, then raised to the 4th, that gives rise to 1. And ultimately then this 1 is then going to connect to a human identity as one person, and then humanity, the collective identity of us. And it is crucial to construct the metacultural digital dimension to recognize that we identify as ourselves and connect as part of a larger system. And what we need to do is cultivate this connection as individuals and human beings as collectives. And the H is a representation of what will be needed to scale up from dyadic relations all the way to the globe. Here we see this idea that the individual is represented here. So here may you be with your beliefs and values represented by the H, human identity. And this then would represent the big H would then be an identity function for all of humanity at the metacultural dimension. The iQuad coin offers what's called the human identity function. So here's the H, and then if we rotate the coin, we can turn it into an I. The human identity function can be understood in relationship to the quadrant quadratic. To understand this, we need to understand the quadrant move, which involves seeing oneself through the epistemological quadrants that ground Ken Wilber's integral theory, and that is the interior first-person view of phenomenology, the exterior individual view of behavior, the interior collective view of culture, and the exterior social or cosmological systems view. In the language of the unified theory, the interior view is mapped by the way in which the unified theory maps human consciousness. The exterior view can be thought of as being mapped by the periodic table of behavior, the scientific analysis of patterns of behavior across the floors of science. The interior shared reality refers to the explicit constructed reality of systems of justification. And then finally, the tree of knowledge view can be thought of as a zoomed out holistic developmental systems view that would then start with the biggest possible systemic view and layer ones then down from that collective view into the individual. So the quadrant function is the invitation of an individual to see their human identity function through these 4 epistemological lenses. Locate yourself through the world through your eyes in the witnessing function. Imagine how a video would take place. Identify the inside of your culture, the emic position, I should say, from an anthropological perspective. That's actually how I will label this in a bit. And the etic position, which is then from the outside systemic view. So with the quadrant view that way, we can now move into the quadratic, which involves seeing oneself in 4 ontological dimensions, specifically as operating at the dimension of matter, life, mind, and culture. This will correspond, by the way, to the various hidden dimensions of complexity represented by the I, or the square root of -1, then raised to the 4th. This then means or represents one being, human being, in 4 dimensions. We can then think about this across the matter object, life organism, mind animal, and culture person, where the matter object is the physical body on the energy matter space-time grid, the living self-organizing physiological cell, the perspectival, to use John Vervaeke's term, procedural, imagining, acting, phenomenological self, and the propositional and self-conscious narrating self that is guided on and operates on the culture person plane of existence. These 4 dimensions refer to the quadratic. These diagrams then capture the relationship between the TOK and the I quadratic formula, or the quadrant quadratic position. The I quad represents the individual self-conscious narration and awareness of their position across the quadrants. It then also represents the hope humanity has for developing into the fifth dimension of complexity. We can see here the various jumps in complexity and culture emerging. Certainly by 50,000 years ago, we have humans narrating in an accelerating form, and perhaps over the last 5,000 years in terms of human civilization, the last 500 years in terms of modern justification systems, and then ultimately we are now in the process of seeing the edge of perhaps the next dimension. So the task of or the invitation then is for whomever this refers to. It's the identification of oneself across the quadratic. And this quadratic analysis allows one to move from the ontological claim of matter, life, mind, culture, and the epistemological claim from interior, exterior, emic and eidic positions, as we were described earlier. So, in so doing, the I quad now represents the awareness of the individual and their place in the cosmos in terms of sort of the Wilbur-Combs cosmic coordinates across culture, across stage, across level of development. This flip back and forth allows for, in my mind, what I am capturing here is the Wilberian integral view across epistemological quadrants and the unified theory of knowledge view across the categories, ontological categories. Okay, so now with that, we want to then basically say that we're going to now, one of the unique things about the unified theory of knowledge is that it allows for a much more fine-grained scientific analysis of behavior across the levels and dimensions as we reviewed. And now we're going to use the periodic table of behavior to ground ourselves into a naturalistic science view and remind ourselves that we are sitting on 12 floors of science that provide a framework of understanding. But ultimately, it is also the case that as we turn from the past that science maps into the future, we see that we are in the process of a fifth joint point. It is this location that the I quad then invites individuals to identify and then turn towards the notion that they're in the process of a metacultural transition, the fifth joint point, or the construction of the 13th floor. This gives rise to a building metaphor. The 13th floor of a building can be thought of as the idea that we are looking at from a scientific view, the building that nature, all the way up through human societies, has constructed, which has as its foundation the matter-object view with its layers of particles, atoms, and molecules, the life-organism view with genes, cells, and multicell, the animal-mind view with neural networks, single animals and groups of animals, and then finally the culture-person view with symbolic justification, self-conscious narrators networked together into social groups and large-scale societies. This is the building metaphor. And what the I quad coin can then represent can be thought of as the construction of a terrace on top of it. And it is this terrace then that sets the stage for the awareness of where one is from an I quadratic perspective into a invitation for a particular kind of wisdom tradition that I am developing with the garden metaphor. So the 13th floor is the entry into the fifth dimension, and the garden is a scientific, humanistic, spiritual way of life. That's what it represents. And the bridge then can be start by enabling individuals to think about themselves as entities that are operating across the quadratic formula, a reflective point about the various domains of science and where one is, a position of one's life into contributing positively to the metacultural dimension, one path being the garden terrace in relationship to that, grounded in terms of science on the periodic table of behavior, but then oriented towards the construction of a values-based, wisdom-oriented lifestyle. So, to connect the coin to the garden, we rotate and then flip it. So here we have the standard position of the coin, which refers to one's human aspect and humanity writ large. We then rotate it to give rise to the identity function, whereby one is identifying across the quadrant quadratic now and locating one's position. And then to align it with the garden, we flip it. So now the theory of knowledge tree is connected and the pathway is formed. So the I-quad path through the fifth joint point can be thought of as fusing our understanding of self in a scientific position and flipping that into an understanding of the theory of knowledge tree, which of course sits in the context of a larger garden. In another video, I will offer a tour of the garden, whereby we'll break down the various symbolic elements, for example, of the me flower in the middle of the tree, the two different kinds of bees, the seeds, and the stone, and help understand what the symbolism is that begins the process of delineating the tapestry that is put together by this representation. In sum, what we are offering here is a representation of knowledge up until this point via 4 dimensions mapped by the tree of knowledge system. This sets the stage for us to understand the fifth joint point, which connects to the singularity. And to do so, we need a digital metacultural transcendent vision. There is actually research that's been done right now on the singularity, in particular by a Russian scientist who has tracked 2 different data sets regarding the evolution of complexity on a remarkable regression line and posits that actually the S curve will cross over I won't explain that in too much detail, but the emerging S curve will cross over between 2027 and 2029, 8 years to come. This then is the singular point of transition. And for me, this is the actual tipping point whereby the establishment of the fifth joint point will be made, and we will actually beginning the process of networking together to genuinely transition into the fifth dimension. The question is how to do that. The I-quad into garden path is the knowledge technology that I offer, and then I suggest that we can all align ourselves in relationship to whatever ultimate wisdom concern might be represented with the iconic representation here of an elephant sun god as the transcendent placeholder for the ultimate good or ultimate concern. To conclude, the unified theory of knowledge consists of 8 key ideas that together afford us a new kind of knowledge technology. The tree of knowledge system is the first key idea. It gives rise to the fifth joint point interpretation of our current situation and moment in history. This sets the stage for us to understand some of the current meta-crises as deeply related or framed by a digital identity problem. The world of the digital and the growth of global civilization, as well as a wide variety of different other elements are causing a massive meaning crisis and mental health crisis, all well understood by the fact that technology and the acceleration of change is outpacing anything that used to take place at the cultural dimension and is now hopefully giving rise to a healthy new dimension. The question is, how do we constrain and frame it without enormous amounts of chaos on the one hand, or a digital order that would give rise to a worldview, something along the lines of 1984, if the order and control of the digital emerged in a horrifying way. The unified theory of knowledge, especially with the tree of knowledge and its fifth joint point, then sets the stage to frame what might be a wise vision of the future in terms of a digital identity solution. The digital identity solution the unified theory of knowledge offers is represented then in the I-Quad Garden project. It symbolizes knowledge and wisdom in the connection of the individual to the transcendent, where an individual engages through the symbol of the coin into a quadrant quadratic that locates them at the beginning of the fifth joint point, locates their own position, sets the stage for a fundamental identity shift, and on the flip side of it, connects to at least one wisdom tradition represented by the theory of knowledge tree that resides in the garden, all of which symbolizing the kind of mythos that is necessary for a coherent scientific humanistic philosophy that orients us towards wisdom in the 21st century.